Commander Jake Mitchell had been stationed on Titan Research Station for 3 long months, and every day felt exactly the same. The small outpost orbited Saturn's largest moon, far from Earth and even farther from anything interesting. Most days, Jake spent his time monitoring deep space communications, listening to the endless chatter of alien civilizations going about their business. Tonight was different, though Jake didn't know it yet. He sat hunched over his console in the cramped communications bay, the soft blue glow of the screens casting shadows across his tired face. His 3rd cup of coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept sipping it anyway. Outside the small porthole, Saturn's rings stretched across the starfield, like a golden highway to nowhere. The routine transmissions filled his headphones with their familiar hum. Trade negotiations between the Centauri merchants and the mining colonies, weather reports from agricultural worlds, navigation updates from cargo haulers crossing the void. Jake had heard it all 1,000 times before. He was just another human, doing another boring job in humanity's tiny corner of the galaxy. Then everything changed. The signal hit his equipment, like lightning striking a calm lake. Jake nearly spilled his coffee as alarms started beeping across his console. This wasn't normal space chatter. This was something else entirely. The transmission cut through every other signal with raw, desperate power. Even before his translation software kicked in, Jake could hear the terror in those alien voices. "This is Captain Veltar of the civilian vessel Hope's Dawn." The message crackled through his speakers. The translation software struggled with the unfamiliar language, producing choppy, broken English that somehow made the desperation even more real. "We carry 50,000 refugees from the Andromedas War. Our engines are failing. The Krex Empire has found us. They will enslave us all. Please, ... anyone, help us." Jake's hands started shaking as he stared at his screens. 50 refugees. The number hit him like a punch to the gut. That was more people than lived in his entire hometown, back on Earth, and they were all going to die. Or worse, if nobody helped them. He'd heard stories about the Krex Empire during his training. They were slavers, pure and simple. They conquered weaker civilizations and put entire populations to work in their factories and mines. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones spent decades as property, working until their bodies gave out. Jake's fingers flew across his keyboard as he prepared to forward the message to Earth's command. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it over the hum of the station's life support systems. This was the first real emergency transmission he'd ever received, and it was a big one. Back on Earth, humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 8 years. Most alien civilizations still thought of humans as primitive newcomers who had barely figured out faster-than-light travel. Earth's military was laughably small by galactic standards. 900 ships total, including everything from massive battleships down to tiny patrol boats. The big players in the galaxy had fleets numbering in the thousands, but Jake knew something the aliens didn't understand about humans. When someone was in trouble, especially innocent people, humans had a habit of doing stupid, dangerous things to help. It didn't matter if the odds were bad or if they might get hurt in the process. It was just how humans were built. The message took less than 30 seconds to reach Earth Command at Luna Base. Admiral Tom Bradley was in his office reviewing supply reports when the transmission arrived. He was a tall, gray-haired man who had spent his entire career preparing for a war that he hoped would never come. Now, suddenly, it was here. Lieutenant Amy Carter burst into his office without knocking, her face pale with worry. "Sir, we've got a situation. Big one." Bradley looked up from his paperwork as Carter activated the wall display. The tactical map showed the outer rim of known space, where a single red dot blinked ominously. Near it, a much smaller blue dot represented the refugee ship. "The Galactic Council received the same transmission we did," Carter explained, her voice tight with anger. "They're calling it a tragedy, but claiming their nearest fleet is weeks away. Sir, those people don't have weeks. They don't even have days. Bradley studied the display, his jaw clenched. 200 Krex warships were closing in on one damaged refugee vessel. It should have been a massacre. The Krex were experienced fighters, with advanced weapons and armor. They'd conquered dozens of worlds using the same tactics, but they'd never fought humans before. What's our response time? Bradley asked quietly. 36 hours, if we launch everything we have, Carter replied. Sir, it's not enough ships. The Krex outnumber us, and their technology is more advanced. Command says we should lodge a formal protest with the Council and offer to take refugees after the fact. Bradley stood up slowly, walking to the window that looked out over the Luna base shipyards. Hundreds of human vessels sat in their berths, from sleek destroyers to massive carriers. They weren't the biggest or most advanced ships in the galaxy, but they were crewed by humans, and humans had learned some very hard lessons about survival during their long, violent history on Earth. Send the recall signal, he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of command. All ships, all crews. I don't care if they're on shore leave or in the middle of maintenance. Everyone comes home now. Carter stared at him. Sir, you're talking about committing our entire fleet. If we lose, Earth will be defenseless. Bradley turned back to face her, and Carter saw something dangerous flickering in his eyes. It was the same look humans got when someone threatened their family. Lieutenant, those are 50,000 innocent people about to be enslaved by monsters. The Galactic Council thinks we're too primitive to matter. The Krex think we're too weak to fight them. Maybe it's time we showed the galaxy what happens when you threaten civilians in front of humans. Within 6 hours, every human warship in the galaxy was racing toward the coordinates where Hope's Dawn drifted helplessly in space. For the first time in galactic history, humanity was going to war, and the universe was about to learn why Earth had produced the most dangerous species it had ever encountered. The age of human military power was about to begin. Captain Lisa Rodriguez had commanded the USS Defiant for 2 years, but nothing had prepared her for this moment. The jump out of hyperspace always made her stomach lurch, but today felt different. Today, they weren't heading to a routine patrol or training exercise. Today, they were going to save lives. The bridge went dead silent as space materialized around them. Rodriguez watched through the main viewport as ship after ship dropped out of hyperspace in perfect formation. The sight took her breath away. Every single vessel in the human fleet had answered Admiral Bradley's call. Big battleships with thick armor plating, fast destroyers built for hit-and-run attacks, massive carriers loaded with fighter squadrons, even old cargo ships that had been fitted with weapons in the shipyards during their 36-hour journey. Jesus Christ, whispered Ensign Mike Thompson from the navigation station. His young face was pressed against his sensor display, eyes wide with shock. Captain, look at the size of that refugee ship. Rodriguez turned her attention to the massive vessel drifting in space ahead of them. The Hope's Dawn was absolutely enormous, stretching 20 kilometers from bow to stern. It looked more like a floating city than a starship. But the beautiful vessel was dying. Huge gashes had been torn in its hull, and atmosphere streamed out into space like blood from a wound. Emergency lights flickered along its length, and Rodriguez could see that entire sections had gone dark, surrounding the refugee ship like a pack of hungry wolves. The Krex warships continued their merciless attack. Their energy weapons lit up space with deadly colors as they systematically destroyed the Hope's Dawn's defenses. Rodriguez counted at least 50 Krex vessels in the immediate area, with more scattered throughout the system. They were taking their time, enjoying the hunt. The Krex ships were sleek and powerful, built for conquest. Their hulls gleamed with advanced armor that could deflect most weapons. Their energy cannons could punch through the shields of any known civilization. They had conquered dozens of worlds using these same tactics. Find a weak target, overwhelm it with superior firepower, then collect the survivors for slavery. But they had never fought humans before. All ships, this is Admiral Bradley. The communication system crackled to life. Rodriguez could hear the cold anger in the Admiral's voice, and it made her smile. These bastards think they can massacre civilians while we watch. Show them what happens when you threaten innocents in front of Deathworlders. Rodriguez felt a surge of pride at that word. Deathworlders. The galaxy had given humans that name, because Earth was considered impossibly hostile by alien standards. Most civilized worlds were peaceful places with gentle weather and friendly animals. Earth was different. Earth had hurricanes that could level cities, earthquakes that split continents, volcanoes that blocked out the sun, predators that hunted in packs and never gave up once they caught a scent. But what the aliens didn't understand was that this harsh environment had created something special. Humans who never quit when things got difficult. Humans who fought harder when the odds were against them. Humans who would risk everything to protect the innocent, even if those innocents were complete strangers from another world. Weapons hot, Rodriguez ordered, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Let's introduce ourselves properly. Her weapons officer, Lieutenant Danny Walsh, grinned as he powered up the Defiance arsenal. The ship carried a mix of human and captured alien technology. Nuclear torpedoes that the galaxy considered barbarically destructive. Kinetic weapons that fired chunks of metal at incredible speeds. Particle beams that could slice through armor like butter. And a few surprises that Earth's engineers had cooked up during the long journey here. The Kreks had never seen anything like human military doctrine. For thousands of years, galactic warfare had followed certain unwritten rules. Ships stayed at long range and exchanged fire until one side's shields failed. Then came formal surrender negotiations. Prisoners were treated with respect. Civilian areas were avoided. It was all very civilized and predictable. Humanity had learned warfare in a different school. On Earth, wars were fought for survival. There were no rules when your species was facing extinction. No mercy when your children were threatened. No surrender when innocent people needed protection. Earth's history was written in blood and fire, and every human carried those lessons in their DNA. The human fleet didn't follow galactic conventions. They didn't slow down to exchange polite long-range fire. They didn't broadcast surrender demands or wait for responses. They saw 50,000 innocent people being murdered by slavers, and they reacted the way humans always reacted to bullies. They accelerated Rodriguez, watched her tactical display as 900 human ships picked up speed, racing directly toward the Kreks formation. The alien vessels seemed confused by this aggressive approach. Their commanders had probably never faced an enemy willing to charge straight into superior firepower. Most civilized species valued their lives too much for such dangerous tactics. But humans weren't most species. They were Deathworlders, forged by a planet that had tried to kill them every single day for millions of years. They had learned that sometimes the only way to win was to be more ruthless than your enemy, more determined, more willing to sacrifice everything for what was right. All weapons, prepare to fire on my command, Rodriguez announced to her crew. Around her, men and women who had been born on a dozen different worlds prepared to fight for people they had never met. Because that's what humans did. When someone was in trouble, you helped them. When bullies picked on the weak, you stood up to them. When monsters threatened innocent people, you became a monster yourself. The Kreks were about to learn a very painful lesson about humanity. They had picked the wrong species to mess with, and now it was time to show them what Deathworlders could really do when they got angry. The battle for the Hope's Dawn was about to begin. Colonel Jack Stevens gripped the controls of his F-47 Raptor fighter as he led the first wave of human ships into battle. Behind him, 47 other pilots followed in tight formation, their engines screaming as they accelerated toward the Kreks fleet. Jack had been flying military fighters for 15 years, but he'd never been in a real space battle before. None of them had. Humanity was too new to the galactic community to have many enemies. That was about to change in a big way. Contact. In 30 seconds, Jack radioed to his squadron, his voice calm, despite the adrenaline pumping through his system. Remember what we learned in training. These aliens have never fought anyone crazy enough to ram them if we have to. They're used to enemies who value their own lives more than the mission. Through his cockpit window, Jack could see the Krek's warships growing larger by the second. They were beautiful, in a deadly way, with smooth hulls that gleamed like polished metal, and weapon arrays that glowed with contained energy. Each ship was probably worth more than his entire squadron combined. The aliens had better technology, better armor, and better shields, but they had never fought humans before. On the bridge of the Krek's flagship, General Dexkar watched the approaching human fighters with growing confusion. He was an experienced military commander who had conquered 17 different worlds during his long career. He understood tactics and strategy better than most beings in the galaxy. But what he was seeing made no sense. The human ships were flying in attack patterns that should have been suicide. They were coming in too fast and too direct, leaving themselves exposed to concentrated fire. Any civilized species would have approached more carefully, using long-range weapons and defensive maneuvers. These primitives were charging straight into his superior force, like wild animals. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, "the humans are not responding to our warning broadcasts. They refuse to acknowledge our demands for surrender." Dexkar's spore eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical display. "Primitives," he growled. "They probably don't even understand what they're facing. Destroy them quickly, then get back to processing the refugees." But when the humans finally came within weapons range, something happened that Dexkar had never experienced in his long military career. Instead of the expected energy beam exchanges that characterized normal space combat, the human ships opened fire with weapons that defied all galactic conventions. Nuclear torpedoes streaked through space like miniature suns, each one carrying enough destructive power to level a city. The weapons had been banned by galactic treaty for over 1,000 years because they were considered barbarically destructive. Civilized species didn't use such crude, devastating tools of war. But humans weren't civilized by galactic standards. The first torpedo struck Dexkar's flagship with the force of a small star going supernova. The explosion tore through the ships. Advanced shields like they were made of paper, sending shock waves through the entire vessel. Emergency alarms started screaming as entire sections lost power. What kind of savages use nuclear weapons in space? Dexkar snarled as his bridge shook under the impact. Around him, his crew scrambled to repair damaged systems while more human torpedoes streaked toward them through the void. But the nuclear weapons were just the beginning. The humans also fired kinetic weapons that seemed impossibly primitive to alien eyes. Simple chunks of metal, some no bigger than telephone poles, accelerated to incredible speeds by magnetic launchers. The Krek's shields were designed to deflect energy beams and absorb radiation, but they couldn't stop solid matter traveling at a significant fraction of light speed. The metal projectiles punched through alien HULs like bullets through cardboard, creating massive holes that vented atmosphere and crew members into space. Systems that had been built to withstand the most advanced energy weapons in the galaxy were destroyed by what amounted to very fast rocks. Jack Stevens watched with grim satisfaction as his squadron's weapons found their targets. The Krek's ships were tough, but they weren't prepared for human-style warfare. Every human pilot had been trained in Earth's military academies, where they learned lessons written in the blood of countless wars. When survival was at stake, there were no rules. When innocent people needed protection, you used whatever weapons worked. "Direct hit on the command ship," reported Lieutenant Tony Martinez from Jack's wing. "Their shields are down to 30%. "Good," Jack replied. pulling his fighter into a tight turn that would have crushed most alien pilots under the G. Now let's show them what boarding actions look like. The real shock for the Krex came when human Marines, led by Sergeant Beth Williams, began their assault on the flagship. Williams had grown up in Detroit, where she'd learned that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies was to hit them harder than they expected. She carried that lesson with her as she led her team through the breach in the Krex hull. The boarding pods had smashed through the alien ship's armor like meteors, and now 20 human Marines were fighting their way through the corridors. The Krex warriors they encountered were physically impressive, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with natural armor plating and claws that could tear through steel. They were stronger than humans, and had been genetically bred for combat, but they had never faced an enemy that smiled while being shot at. "Welcome to Earth tactics, ugly," Williams growled as she emptied her assault rifle into a Krex soldier twice her size. The alien warrior roared in pain and anger, but Williams just reloaded and kept firing. When her ammunition finally ran out, she pulled out a combat knife and charged forward with a battle cry that would have made her ancestors proud. The Krex had conquered dozens of species through intimidation and superior firepower. Their standard tactic was to demonstrate overwhelming force until their enemies surrendered. Most civilized beings valued their lives more than abstract principles like freedom or justice. But humans weren't most beings. They were Deathworlders who had learned to fight on a planet where everything wanted to kill them. They treated warfare not as a political tool or economic necessity, but as a personal insult that demanded violent retribution. As the battle raged through the corridors of the Krex flagship, General Vexkar began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. These weren't civilized opponents who would surrender when faced with superior odds. These were creatures who seemed to get more dangerous when they were hurt, more determined when they were outnumbered. For the first time in his long career, Vexkar began to feel something he had never experienced before: fear. Captain Dave Wilson stood on the bridge of the USS Thunderbolt, watching the chaos of battle unfold across his tactical display. Green dots representing human ships darted between the larger red symbols of Krex vessels, like angry wasps attacking a bear. The sight filled him with a mixture of pride and horror. Pride because his people were fighting with incredible courage. Horror because he could see how many weren't going to make it home. The battle had been raging for 20 minutes, and the humans were proving something that had never been demonstrated before in galactic history. Superior numbers and advanced technology didn't always win wars. Sometimes, raw determination and willingness to sacrifice everything could overcome impossible odds. "Sir, the Roosevelt is taking heavy damage," reported Lieutenant Karen Foster from the tactical station. Her voice was tight with worry as she monitored the destroyer's status. Hull breaches on 3 decks, engines at 30% power, and life support failing in the aft sections. Wilson nodded grimly as he watched the Roosevelt's icon on his display. The ship had been hit by concentrated Krex fire for the past 5 minutes, absorbing punishment that would have destroyed most vessels. But Captain Sam Morrison was still fighting, still trying to protect the refugee transports that were slowly limping away from the battle zone. Then something happened that made Wilson's blood freeze. The Roosevelt suddenly changed course, turning directly toward the largest Krex dreadnought in the formation. Morrison's voice crackled over the fleet communication system, calm and steady despite the chaos around him. "This is Captain Morrison. To all ships," he said, and Wilson could hear explosions in the background. "My engines are gone and my weapons are offline, but I've still got 1 shot left." There was a pause, filled with the sound of alarms and shouting crew members. "Tell my wife I love her, and tell these alien bastards welcome to Earth." Wilson watched in stunned silence as the Roosevelt accelerated toward the enemy dreadnought, using its last functioning thruster to build up ramming speed. The Krex ship tried to turn away, but it was too big and too slow. The human destroyer struck the alien vessel amidships with the force of a kinetic weapon. both ships disappearing in a brilliant explosion that lit up the entire battlefield. The sacrifice wasn't meaningless. 3 refugee transports that had been trapped by the dreadnought's weapons suddenly had a clear escape route. Thousands of innocent lives had been saved by one man's decision to give up everything. Across the battle zone, similar acts of heroism were playing out as human crews pushed their ships and themselves beyond all reasonable limits. Fighter pilot Jenny Brooks pulled 12 Gs in a turn that should have killed her, pursuing a Krex bomber that was targeting civilian vessels. Lieutenant Commander Ray Parker deliberately flew his damaged cruiser into a formation of enemy fighters, taking out 6 ships with his exploding reactor core on the bridge of the Krex flagship. General Dexkar stared at his tactical reports with growing horror. His aide, a younger officer named Sub-Commander Krill, stood beside him with all 4 eyes wide with shock. "Sir," Krill reported, his voice shaking, "the humans are using their damaged ships as weapons. They're treating their own wounded vessels like guided missiles." Dexkar couldn't believe what he was seeing. In all his years of military service, he had never encountered an enemy that fought like this. Civilized species valued their ships, and crews too much to throw them away in suicidal attacks. When a vessel was badly damaged, the logical response was to withdraw it from combat and attempt repairs. But these humans seemed to view damaged ships as opportunities rather than liabilities. When their weapons failed, they used their ships as weapons. When their shields collapsed, they accelerated into ramming attacks. When their life support failed, they kept fighting until their last breath. "These aren't soldiers," Vexkar whispered to his aide, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and terror. "These are madmen. They fight like they have nothing to lose." What the Krex commander didn't understand was that humans had everything to lose. 50,000 innocent refugees were depending on them. Their species' reputation in the galactic community was at stake. Most importantly, their own sense of right and wrong demanded that they stop these slavers from hurting helpless civilians. Meanwhile, on the Hope's dawn, Captain Veltar watched the impossible battle through his ship's damaged viewports. The refugee vessel was slowly moving away from the combat zone, protected by a screen of human destroyers that had sacrificed themselves to buy time. Veltar had been a starship captain for over 40 years, but he had never seen anything like this. The human fleet was clearly outmatched. They had fewer ships, older technology, and less powerful weapons than their enemies. By every logical measure, they should have been destroyed within the first few minutes of combat. Instead, they were actually winning through sheer, terrifying aggression. "They fight like their homeworld," Veltar murmured to his first officer, a young female named Kessa. "Brutal, relentless, unforgiving." Kessa nodded, her large eyes fixed on the human ships as they swarmed through the Krex formation. "I've heard stories about Earth," she said quietly. "They say it's a world where everything tries to kill you. Storms that can destroy cities, predators that hunt in packs, diseases that spread like wildfire. And now we see what that world produced," Veltar replied. "Warriors who never give up, never surrender, and never let innocent people suffer while they still draw breath." As if to prove his point, a human fighter pilot named Chuck Davis flew his damaged F-47 Raptor directly into the engine compartment of a Krex cruiser, destroying both ships in a massive explosion. The pilot's last transmission was a rebel yell that echoed across all frequencies, a sound of pure defiance that made every human in the fleet fight harder. The galaxy was learning a lesson that would reshape interstellar politics for generations to come. Earth hadn't just produced another spacefaring species. They had created the most dangerous warriors the universe had ever seen, and those warriors were now loose among the stars, ready to fight anyone who threatened the innocent. The Krex Empire was about to discover that some enemies were too dangerous to make, no matter how primitive they seemed. Admiral Tom Bradley stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Liberty. watching as the final Krex warship exploded in a brilliant flash of light that illuminated the entire battlefield. The silence that followed was deafening. After 30 minutes of the most intense combat the galaxy had ever witnessed, the shooting had finally stopped. Around him, the surviving human ships began to regroup, their hulls scarred and blackened from battle damage. Many vessels limped through space on emergency power, trailing debris and venting atmosphere from dozens of hull breaches. The fleet looked like it had been through hell, which wasn't far from the truth. Bradley's communication officer, Lieutenant Gary Collins, looked up from his console with a mixture of exhaustion and pride on his young face. "Sir, final casualty reports are coming in. We lost 67 ships total. The Roosevelt, the Washington, the Denver, and 64 others that won't be coming home." Bradley nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those losses settle on his shoulders. 67 ships meant over 12,000 crew members who had given their lives to save people they had never met. In galactic terms, it was considered a light casualty rate for such an aggressive assault. But Bradley knew that every single one of those losses represented someone's son or daughter, husband or wife, brother or sister. Still, they had accomplished something incredible. The entire Krex fleet had been destroyed or forced to retreat. Not a single enemy vessel remained in the system to threaten the refugees. "All civilian vessels secure," reported Captain Rodriguez over the communication system from her damaged destroyer. Her voice was hoarse from shouting orders during the battle, but there was no mistaking the satisfaction in her tone. 50,000 refugees safe and accounted for. The Hope's Dawn is badly damaged, but stable. Medical teams are already aboard, helping with wounded civilians. Bradley allowed himself a small smile. They had done it, against impossible odds, with inferior numbers and older technology. The human fleet had defeated one of the galaxy's most feared military forces. The Krex Empire had been stopped cold by a species that most aliens considered primitive newcomers, but the real impact of the battle was just beginning to be felt across the galaxy. The entire fight had been broadcast on emergency frequencies, picked up by monitoring stations on dozens of worlds. For the first time, the galactic community had witnessed human military doctrine in action. What they saw changed everything they thought they knew about the species from Earth. Bradley activated his ship's long-range transmitter, broadcasting on a frequency that he knew would reach every major government in known space. His words would be recorded and studied by military analysts for generations to come. "This is Admiral Bradley of the Earth Defense Force, transmitting to all Galactic Council members," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had just proven his point with actions rather than words. "You called us Deathworlders, like it was an insult. We prefer to think of it as a job description. The refugees are under human protection now. Anyone who wants to change that is welcome to try." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 6 hours of the battle's end, Earth's diplomatic channels were flooded with incoming messages. 12 different species sent formal applications requesting defensive alliances with humanity. The Zephyrian Federation, one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations, offered immediate technology exchanges and mutual defense treaties. Even the mighty Centauri Republic, which had barely acknowledged humanity's existence before the battle, sent diplomatic overtures through their embassy on Alpha Centauri. The message was simple. They wanted to discuss closer ties with Earth's military forces. But perhaps the most significant response came from Captain Veltar himself. The refugee leader's message to the Galactic Council was broadcast across every major news network in known space, and it would be quoted in history books for centuries to come. 4 cycles, you dismissed the humans as primitive barbarians, Veltar said, his voice heavy with emotion as he spoke from the damaged bridge of the Hope's Dawn. You called them Deathworlders and looked down on them as violent savages who had barely learned to travel between stars. Today, they proved that sometimes the most dangerous predator isn't the largest or the most advanced. Sometimes it's the one that learned to survive on a world that tried to kill it every single day. The captain paused, looking directly into the camera with eyes that had seen too much suffering. My people owe our lives to these so-called primitives. While the great powers of the galaxy debated and made excuses, the humans came without hesitation. They fought without regard for their own safety. They died to protect strangers they had never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. In the weeks that followed the battle, human shipyards worked around the clock to repair damaged vessels and build new ones. But they weren't working alone anymore. Alien engineers and technicians arrived daily, offering advanced technologies and manufacturing techniques in exchange for defensive agreements. Refugee ships from across the galaxy began arriving at Earth, carrying civilians fleeing from various conflicts and disasters. They came because word had spread throughout the galactic community. If you were in trouble, if you were being hunted or threatened or oppressed, the humans would help you. They didn't ask about your species or your politics or what you could offer in return. They just helped, because that's what humans did. The galaxy had discovered something that would reshape interstellar politics for generations to come. The Deathworlders from Sol 3 weren't just tough survivors who could endure harsh conditions. They were something far more valuable and far more dangerous. They were the best friends you could have when things went wrong, and they were the worst enemies you could make if you threatened innocent people. The Krex Empire learned this lesson the hard way, and their defeat sent shockwaves through every military force in known space. Overnight, human military doctrine became the most studied subject in galactic war colleges. Species that had ignored or dismissed humanity suddenly wanted to know everything about Earth's history, culture, and military philosophy. The age of human military dominance had begun, not through conquest or intimidation, but through an act of pure heroism that proved what humans were really capable of when innocent lives were at stake. The Deathworlders had announced their presence to the galaxy in the most human way possible, by risking everything to save complete strangers, and the universe would never be the same again.